starting with co-location, and I think it would be useful so that we're on the same page in terms of terminology, in terms of the baseline, to very quickly walk through what I see as the market taxonomy for these sort of services and indeed the players. So when you look at co-location, the history to co-location, of course, is that at least carrier-neutral co-location, that is. It started off primarily with what were called carrier hotels, and this goes back to the last dot-com boom in the late 90s and early 90s. Now, that industry structure has evolved, obviously, over the last 16 plus years. And what we now have is, I think, 3 or 4 sub-segments. The first, which remains, is interconnection, although the nature of interconnection is changing, and it feeds into what you're seeing in the cloud and network services. The basic product in terms of interconnection continue to be facilities in metro city center locations that are carrier dense, right? So these are sites from anywhere between 50 to 500 carriers. They tend to be older facilities. The spec of the facility tends to be not that great in terms of resilience and in terms of the number of lines and so on. But because of the sheer density of the carriers, and because carriers will have placed in a number of instances some of the primary nodes for a region or secondary nodes, it's impossible for the carriers to exit. And that essentially means that any content provider, whether that's a Facebook or Google or whoever, must propose host in that site or tether into that site to another closed facility in order to access that density of connections. And of course, following from that come financial services and more recently cloud service providers with their edge and network node deployments. So metro city center interconnection facilities have remained sort of the center of gravity, if you will, for this industry. So that continues. However, that co-location subsegment of the market has only been growing in single digits. So I'd be surprised if any company reports any more than 5 to 7% year-on-year growth in terms of revenues from that subsegment. For a couple of reasons. Number one, as I mentioned, the facilities themselves are old. They're in highly built-up locations. And so adding more density, more square footage or power into those facilities tends to be a bit of a challenge. But even where that's overcome, you run into demand dynamics, which is how many more half racks or racks can you sell to a carrier who already has, for example, a primary node. And so any increase in the footprint of a carrier or content provider is driven organically by their own end customer demand. So these sites tend to be cash cows, growing very slowly at 5 to 7%, and requiring very little further capital expenditure. There is always maintenance capex, of course, and a certain level of whatever is the standard level of OPEX in terms of running these sites, but they do not tend to be capex sinks. They are, in terms of EBITDA and free cash flow, they are extremely attractive sites, and they end up being the crown jewels of operators in this industry. Okay, so that's the first subsegment of co-location.
Okay, and would you say that part of the subsector is quite crowded, and because it's a lot of capacity in a city such as London, you see some pricing pressure?
No. If anything, the opposite. The interconnection part of co-location is highly defensible. It is next to impossible to reproduce interconnection dense locations. Churn levels are non-existent.
Okay.
Churn is below 1%.